All right, in this video I want to talk about the two primary ways you can set up an experimental design, which is between subjects designs, where you compare distinct groups of people, each assigned to like a different condition, and within subjects designs, where you have all the people do each of the conditions. Now let's start off by thinking about different types of research questions where we might want to compare like two sets of data. For example, do men and women own equal numbers of shoes? Here we're comparing some pre-existing distinct groups, but it's basically just measuring a couple variables. We might find a correlation between gender and shoe ownership, but a correlation is all that it is. But compare that to a research question like, do people randomly assigned to eat vegetarian for a month have lower cholesterol than people randomly assigned to eat only meat for a month? Now, it sounds like we're comparing here two groups of people, but we put them in these groups. We controlled it, and then we manipulated each group's diet for a month. That's different than comparing people who already eat vegetarian to people who already eat meat, because those people would have a bunch of other pre-existing differences too. So this is clearly an experimental design. We've gone beyond a mere correlational study, and this idea of assigning participants into different groups, it's pretty familiar at this point, right? But what about this next research question? Is there a difference in weekly money spent before versus after a budgeting course? So here it sounds like we might just measure how much a bunch of people spend, and then we give all those people the budgeting course, and then we just measure again the same people after the course to see what they're now spending. So it's measuring the same people repeatedly to see if on average they've changed. Or this one. It looks a lot like the second one I just talked about, but do people assigned to eat vegetarian for a month have lower cholesterol during that month than when those same people are assigned to eat only meat for a different month? Now we've got one set of people, but we have them all do both the veggie condition and the meat condition at different times. So there are some fundamental differences to how our studies, even as experiments, can be carried out, and those have implications for the statistics that we use to compare our two samples, but also for how we interpret the results. And we're going to see there are some pros and cons to both of the different designs. So let's start with the between subjects research design, also sometimes called an independent measures design. This is when we do an experiment comparing different independent groups, and each participant only is in one of those groups. So their scores are independent from the scores of the people in the other group. So they receive just one condition or treatment each. Like you end up in one group, you give your score, and you're done. So for example, we might compare our treatment group's mean score to our placebo group's mean score to make an inference about how the treatment and placebo would work in the population. By the way, the symbol here, it's a Greek letter mu. It's just used for a population mean, as in an average of a whole population of values. Or another example would be comparing the mean of our anger group to the mean of our relaxation group. And again, these are groups we assigned, and we made some people angry and different people we made relaxed. Like maybe we used an enraging story or a very chill story that they listened to or something like that. And again, we would use inferential statistics to generalize from our two group samples to the entire population to make an inference about like anger and relaxation in general. Now, for between subject experiments, if there's just two groups being compared, like in those examples, then the test for a statistically significant difference between them, our usual tool, would be an independent samples t-test. It performs a t-test on the difference between sample means to let you make inferences about the population means from which those samples were drawn. In short, an independent samples t-test is our tool for comparing two different groups. So it's perfect for a between subjects design like we've been talking about. Now, just a side note here, but imagine we weren't doing a true experiment. We weren't using random assignment. Maybe instead we're just comparing two groups that are like pre-existing, like cat people versus dog people. That would also use an independent samples t-test, by the way, because again, the independent samples t-test is our tool to compare two distinct groups, regardless of whether the data is experimental or correlational. However, there is a whole other style of experimental design, which is a within subjects design, also sometimes called a repeated measures design. So in that case, we are not comparing different groups of people necessarily, but more commonly, we're comparing different conditions across the same set of participants, the same people. Like maybe a before score and an after score for everyone, before treatment and after treatment. Or maybe a sleep-deprived score versus a well-slept score, but for all the same people. We test them on a day when they're sleep-deprived, and we test the same people on a day when they've slept well. scores in those cases are naturally paired together, right? Because they come from the same person. So each participant is doing each of the conditions. So if we've got just two conditions, like a treatment condition and a control condition, then everyone is doing both of those. But maybe some people do treatment first and control second. The other people do control condition first, treatment second, something like that. Or another example would be compare people's pre-treatment score to those same people's post-treatment score. Or comparing pre-workout values to their values post-workout for the same 100 people or whatever. So those are examples of within subjects design. Now for within subjects experiments, if there's just two sets of related or paired scores like we've talked about that are being compared, like before versus after, or treatment month versus control month, then to test for a statistically significant difference, our usual tool would be a dependent samples t-test. You'll sometimes hear this called a related samples t-test because the two groups of scores are not independent. So this dependent samples t-test, it just performs a t-test on what we call the mean difference, so the average of each pair's difference. In short, a dependent samples t-test is our tool for comparing two related or paired groups of scores. So it's perfect for a within subjects design. Now when I say the dependent samples t-test is testing the mean difference, here's what I mean. Say we have each participant give us a before data and an after data. Like they give us a score at the start and then they give us a score after the treatment. And we want to know, is there a difference between the average before score and the average after score? You can see here how we would line up the data like this, where each participant gets their own line, their own row, and thus their scores are naturally paired. Both of those scores come from Bob. Both of those scores come from Liz. We can then calculate the sample mean of all our before scores and do the same thing for our after scores. But what we're really looking at, what we're really doing with the dependent samples t-test, is finding each person's difference score, meaning how much they've changed before to after. And then you just take the average of all those. So an average of that rightmost column here, that's the mean difference. The average of that, we get to plug that into an equation. That's how the dependent samples t-test works. So we're looking at whether that mean difference here is significant, statistically significant. Now again, just a side note for the moment, but dependent samples t-test, it would also be used to compare two sets of scores that are matched or paired in some other way that makes them not independent. Like if you have data from pairs of twins, then in that case, the two scores from each pair of twins would go together. Or if you have scores from spouse-spouse pairs, then the two scores from each of those couples go together. And since they're related in this way, we would do the dependent samples t-test. A common example, though this is really heteronormative, would be asking husbands what percentage of chores they think they do, and then asking their wives what percentage of chores they think the husband does. You would use a dependent samples t-test to see if the men on average perceive their contribution to be higher than what their wives perceive the husband's contribution to be. Okay, getting back to a within subjects experiment though, what makes them so cool and so powerful is that since each participant is serving in all the conditions, it means each person, in a sense, is serving as their own personal control group. Like imagine we take measurements on every subject at a low 10 milligram dose and maybe a high dose of the drug we're testing at 40 milligrams, and also maybe everyone does a time where they're not on the drug at all. Probably we'd give it to them in a pill that looked identical in all those conditions, so they wouldn't even know which condition they're doing at any given time. But notice everyone here, subject 1, subject 3, whoever, has a built-in control subject to compare to, which is themselves. It's a really good control subject. To see why this is so helpful and so cool, think about our old between subjects designs, where people in each condition are literally different people. In a between subjects design, dude 1 here might be in the treatment group, and dude 2 is one of the people assigned to the control group. So they've been assigned to different levels of the the independent variable. But that's not the only thing different about these two people. They also differ in height and age and mood and sleepiness and intelligence and a bunch of other ways too. So it adds a lot of noise to the experiment. On the other hand, in a within subjects design, dude 1 is assigned to the treatment group, but we're comparing that to a second dude in the control group that's the same person, right? It's dude 1 in the control group. So they have all the same age, all the same height, all the same intelligence. Literally at that point, the only real difference is the independent variable. So that's why that's a benefit to within subjects designs. That means in a within subject design, each condition starts out very similar. Same number of male, female, same number of tall or short, same number, same distribution of IQ. same in every way. And in this case, it's not because of random assignment making the different groups of people average out and be the same on all variables. Instead, all the conditions start out the same because each group is now literally the same on all variables because it's just the same ass people. Now that said, within subject experiments do have a significant drawback, a trade-off to be aware of, and something that we need to minimize. And that's something called carryover effects. So carryover effects are when participating in one condition affects how you will do the other conditions later. Like your score in the second condition is affected by what you did in condition 1. That would be a carryover effect. So imagine, for example, that we did a study comparing memory performance in a bunch of Alzheimer's participants. And maybe they all first did a month with the placebo pill, then they all did a month with the real medication pill, the real treatment. If the memory scores during that treatment month are better, right? They're better with the real medication. They're higher than the scores during placebo time. It might be that the treatment works. That would be cool. Or though, it could be what we call a practice effect, which is just one type of carryover effect. Basically, you get better at the memory tasks because you did them in the earlier condition. Or consider what if we did the opposite ordering of those conditions? Like, what if we had everyone do the treatment first and then do the placebo condition? Again, we might find that the treatment condition gives better memory scores, like they're lower during the placebo. Cool. And now we know that can't be due to practice effects, but it could be due here to what we call a fatigue effect, which is where participating in an earlier condition maybe tires you out or makes you worse or less motivated on the task when you measure it in later conditions. So like a practice effect, this is a type of carryover effect. But it means that even if you reverse the conditions here, you still have some sort of potential alternative explanation other than our independent variable. There's also what we call a contrast effect that can happen, which is, again, a type of carryover effect, but it just means you perform differently in a later condition because of something about your experience in an earlier condition that makes something about this one more salient. So for example, if we're testing how people react to beautiful faces versus ugly faces, and maybe we have the beautiful pictures in the first condition. Everyone just rated a bunch of beautiful pictures of gorgeous people. Then when people get to the ugly condition, they might not be answering how they normally would. Maybe they're sort of extra biased against ugly people because they're comparing now to those stunning and gorgeous examples they saw in the first condition. That would artificially inflate the difference. So our data wouldn't be great, right? So all of these carryover effects, they are problems that arise when everyone does a particular condition prior to doing some other condition. Now, we're not going to be able to altogether avoid carryover effects. Any within subject experiment will always have participants doing multiple conditions. So there will be some possibility of some carryover effects. But we can absolutely minimize the issue and make it less of a problem. So our main solution then, the best solution, is generally counterbalancing. Basically, rather than having everyone do treatment first and then everyone does placebo after that, you could have different participants do the conditions in different order. So that doesn't remove carryover effects altogether, but it balances them out, and a lot of the issues get canceled out, so the problem is much smaller than it would be otherwise. Now, when you get into more than just two conditions, like let's say you have everyone do an easy condition, a medium condition, and a hard condition, right? They take turns doing these 3 different tasks. Then you have to make sure all the possible orderings are balanced out in some way. Like if you've noticed here, the way I've laid it out here, I've ensured that easy is followed by medium 2 times, but also there are 2 times when medium is followed by easy, just like there are 2 times where medium is followed by hard, and 2 cases where hard is followed by easy, and 2 cases where medium comes before easy, or medium comes before hard, or hard comes before easy, and so on for all the possibilities. Basically, you want to find a setup where all the orderings are evened out across the participants, and that way if there are carryover effects, they'll kind of balance each other out. And indeed, we could even look at our data afterward and test or quantify how much carryover effect there was for any given order of conditions. Like we could look at all the scores people gave in our hard condition and then see if the hard scores were on average different when hard came right after medium or when hard came right after easy. So we can test for a lot of that stuff. Now, for now, we won't get into the nitty-gritty of how to set up counterbalancing, but just know that the most perfect way would be what we call complete counterbalancing, where you assign participants equally to every possible ordering of your conditions. But if you get to a lot of conditions, like if you get to 5 conditions in your study, that is 120 possible orderings. So you've got to have at least 120 participants just to represent each ordering once, and ideally you want a multiple of that. On the other hand, there is a more efficient solution that's a lot easier, and it offers most of the same benefit. It's called a Latin square design, but we'll save those details for later. The important thing is, if we mix up the order of conditions throughout our study, we will have less risk that one specific ordering of conditions is having some big carryover effect on our final results. So stepping back and looking at the 2 types of designs we've discussed here, there are pros and cons to both of them. With between subject designs, they're nice and conceptually simple. You have 3 conditions, okay, then randomly split participants into 3 groups. You have 2 conditions, well then randomly assign them into 2 groups. It's easy peasy. Another pro is that it avoids those carryover effects since everyone just does a single condition. There's no chance for practice effects or contrasting with an earlier condition that they did, right? Now a main con or drawback is that it has less statistical power to detect effects. In practice, this means you need more participants to carry out the same study effectively, to have the same statistical power. Now, within subject design has its own pros, like there is much less noise from the individual differences since we're reusing the same people. And that means it has more statistical power, so it can actually detect real effects more easily. In practice, that means you can use fewer participants to be just as effective. And that is especially great if the study is expensive or if participants are hard to recruit or things like that. But as we saw, there is definitely a con, the main one, which is carryover effects. It forces us to do counterbalancing, and even then, even though we may never fully remove carryover effects, we can at least minimize them with counterbalancing. All right, let's stop there for now. We could talk a lot more about how to decide what research design to use, but honestly, a research question can often be answered in multiple different ways. And sometimes we're just going to become more and more confident that an effect is real once we've studied it using both between subjects and within subjects designs, as well as maybe using different operational definitions for the constructs and things like that. Nothing's really answered in a single research study, but I'm telling you, one well-designed study is going to contribute a hell of a lot more to science than one that is sloppy or leaves out important components like randomizing or counterbalancing. Those studies often just muddy the waters and take us further from the truth rather than closer to it.